Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning, everyone.
Welcome to the Teachers Retirement System Investment Meeting for December 6th, 2018. Patricia, would you please call the roll?
Yes. John Apple.
Present.
Thomas Brown.
Here.
David Kazansky.
Present.
Lindsay Oates. Deborah Penny. Here. Susanna Vickers. Here. We have a quorum.
Thank you, Patricia. Before we move into the agenda, there's been a request to add an item to the agenda, which would be the Common Investment Meeting Extension Resolution. We would do that at the end of the public session after we come out of executive session. Any objections to adding that to the agenda? Okay, seeing none, that's unanimous consent, so we will add that item to the agenda. And with that, I will turn the meeting over to Rokaton for the performance report.
Morning.
Morning, Michael.
Morning.
So we circulated in advance the quarterly performance report for the third quarter of 2018, calendar year 2018. Maybe we've already reviewed this performance at prior meetings, and because the report was circulated ahead of time, maybe I'll just cite it on very high level again, how the passport funds did, but I'm not going to go through the report in detail. Happy to answer any questions that come up. At the end of the third quarter, the diversified equity fund was about $16.2 billion in assets. The performance for the calendar year to date was a positive return of 7.3%. For the fiscal year to date, that's being one quarter, the fund was up 5.5%. And relative to the hybrid benchmark for those time periods, the fund was roughly in line or slightly behind its hybrid benchmark. During that time period, the broad U.S. equity market was up about 7% for the third quarter, and for the calendar year to date through the third quarter, the U.S. equity market was up about 10.5%.
On our sheet, it says that all of those...
I'm sorry, I'm focused on the quarterly performance.
Oh.
And I should have noted I'm on page 21 of that report, which is just behind tab 5.
How much things change.
Yeah.
Yes.
And we'll talk about how things have changed since then.
Okay.
Unfortunately,
We like that spot in
so
time.
what really drove the performance for the fund during the first quarter of the fiscal year, or third quarter of the calendar year, was really strong performance by U.S. equity markets. As I noted earlier, up about 7% during the time period. Non-U.S. markets had a modest positive return of about 1.5%. Even though the defensive strategies composite did not keep up as we would expect with the broad U.S. equity markets, it did return about 3.8%, so it captured about 54% of the U.S. upmarket. And you'll recall that includes other diversifying asset classes to help with that downside protection that we did see a little bit of in October. And with respect to active management, as a whole, active management had a modestly detracted from the relative returns of this fund. It was about 25 basis points of the relative performance in terms of how active management impacted the fund for the quarter. So I'll pause there, and if there's no questions, I'll go into the other funds.
Any questions on the equity fund?
The balanced fund ended the quarter with assets of about $386 million. For the quarter, that fund was up about 1.3%. The year-to-date return there is positive to the tune of about 90 basis points. That fund, as you recall, is implemented passively, so it generally tracks its 70-30 bond to stock benchmark. The International Equity Fund, with assets of about $159 million, that fund was down about 1.65% calendar year to date through the end of the third quarter, and for the first quarter of the fiscal year, it was up about 1.4%. The Inflation Protection Fund, with assets of about $65 million, that fund had a flat return for the third quarter of 2018, and for the calendar year to date, that fund was up about 1.3% ahead of its custom benchmark. And the Socially Responsive Equity Fund, with assets of about $215 million, that fund was up about 9%, and it lagged the S&P by about 1.5%. So if there was no questions on the third quarter, we can spend a little bit more time talking about what's happened since.
No.
Okay, so now we'll flip to the October report. And as we talked about at the last meeting, October was a particularly tough month for the markets. Think of it as essentially erasing the positive returns in the prior 3 months that we just talked about. So the U.S. equity market was down about 7.4%, and the diversified equity fund performed roughly in line with the U.S. equity market as well as its hybrid benchmark, which were also down about 7.4%. That brought the calendar year-to-date return of the diversified equity fund to negative 0.67%. And that compares to the broad U.S. equity market of about 2.4%. What we did see during the month, which was, I guess, in some respects reassuring, was that the defensive strategies composite did what it was supposed to do. So even though it was down about 5.3%, it only captured about 70% of the down market that we saw in the U.S. What helped with that was the lower volatility equity strategies in that composite, the allocation to convertibles, as well as some of the more diversified tactical asset allocation managers that allocate across capital markets. With respect to the actively managed U.S. and international equity composites, there we saw some relative underperformance on the U.S. side, but some relative outperformance on the international equity side. And all told, as I mentioned earlier, that fund was performed roughly in line with its benchmarks for the month. One thing I did note when I was commenting about the September assets, and we talked about the diversified equity fund at the end of the quarter had about $16.2 billion. At the end of the month, that was about $14.9 billion. So again, a significant market impact that you get when the market's down 7%.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So, I get that the defensive strategies, outperformed the Russell 3000 for the 3 months, by about 20 basis points, and for the month of October, terrible month, by about 200 basis points. Yet, when we look at it compared to the Russell 3000 index, the overall diversified equity fund, it was either equivalent to the index, or for the quarter, it was down about 120 basis points. Actively managed, substantially underperformed in both of those periods. International is essentially in line with the international. I'm just like trying to figure out. So we have this whole defensive composite, and it's specifically there for periods like this. And so you would think then that overall we would outperform in a negative market, but we didn't.
Well,
So
the defensive composite is only 10% of the
Okay.
fund, and it's still, we designed the defensive composite, and there's no reason you should have called this, but when we've had discussions with the board, we've designed the defensive composite to have a beta of 0.8, so that we'd have some participation on the way up.
Right.
So
and
there
we just
is-
increased that last year, I think.
Yes,
Right.
yes. And so there is only a modest opportunity to shelter the total fund from down equity markets. Again, because it's 10%, we have an equity beta of 0.8. If the only way to actually significantly mitigate the risk protect the fund against the risk of a significant market downturn is to do something that has much less beta. So this goes back to the pension fund discussions, long treasury bonds.
I understand.
And then you run the risk of significantly lagging on the way up.
I get that.
Yeah.
And maybe this is, a concern that given that we are really still in the midst of this long bull market,
Yeah.
we haven't yet, we're close, I think, but we haven't yet exited it, is what I would say, especially, anyway, maybe now we have.
Yeah, and I'm not sure the exact.
In December,
yeah,
but
yeah.
whatever. But, when I look at the performance across time periods,
Yes.
we consistently underperform the index. In each of the or the benchmark, really. And so the question I have, and this is all net, right? Net of fees.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So can I jump in?
Yes, please. You know where I'm going.
Yeah, I do know where you're going, and I think that's obviously a legitimate question. We have a discussion in the executive agenda
Okay.
of today regarding the passport options.
Yeah.
And I think that discussion will touch on one of the points you're raising.
Okay. Fantastic. Thank you. Anything else on the month of October? Let's put that in the rear view. Okay. You want to do November for me?
So November was a positive month across markets, with a couple exceptions. In the U.S., the Russell 3000 was up about 2%, bringing the calendar year-to-date return back up to about 4.5% through the end of November. Since then, December's been a little bit more rocky, and the market's down a little bit yet today. But as a whole, the S&P is probably still up about 1% 1% year-to-date. The international composite benchmark, when you roll that up, that was actually also modestly flat to slightly positive for the month of November. What's going on behind the scenes there? EM actually drove up the return there and supported that. EM was up, the custom benchmark there was up about 3% during November. Even the developed markets were modestly negative in both large cap and a little bit more negative in small cap. The small cap portion of developed markets was down about 85 basis points. And then as far as the defensive strategies benchmark, that was up about 1.5% for the month. So the diversified equity funds hybrid benchmark, all told, was up about 1.6%. The balanced funds benchmark was up about 70 basis points. The underlying strategy for the inflation protection fund had a flat month. And the underlying strategy for the socially responsive equity fund added about 150 over its benchmark.
Okay, any questions about November?
David's going to hand out the handout for the discussion of the SIM resolution.
No, we're going to do
No,
that.
no,
We're
that's
gonna do that
exactly
after
Oh,
we
that-
come back.
okay.
That's at the end.
Okay.
So I think that's all for the public agenda for now. Okay? All right, so with that, a motion to exit public session and enter executive session would be in order. Is there such a motion?
So, moves pursuant to
Public Officers Law 105.
Public Officers Law 105.
Oh, thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion? All in favor of the motion to exit public session and enter executive session, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, please say nay. Any abstentions? Motion carries. We're back in public session. Susan, would you report out of executive session, please?
Great. In executive session, there was a discussion about the portfolio of options in the passport funds. Consensus was reached, which will be announced at the appropriate time. There was a presentation on certain passive investment strategies. There was a discussion of corporate development to a service provider. There was a follow-up discussion on the small cap allocation within the TRS pension fund, and an administrative matter was discussed.
Thank you very much. We have one resolution to consider here regarding extension of participation in the common investment meeting.
Okay.
Patricia, would you read it?
Whereas
Skip to the result.
resolved, the Teachers Retirement Board extends for 1 year period its participation in the common investment meetings as described and subject to the conditions of the board's 2015 and 2016 SIM resolutions. And be it further resolved, nothing in this resolution shall abrogate any rights or waive any responsibilities reserved to the Board of Trustees under applicable law.
Thank you. Is there a motion to approve this resolution?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion? All in favor of the resolution to extend our participation in the common investment meeting, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, please say nay. Any abstentions? Motion carries. I believe that concludes our business for today. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion? All in favor of the motion to adjourn, please say aye.
Aye.
It's unanimous. The motion carries. The meeting is adjourned. Thank you.